Morning, everyone. We're just waiting for everybody to join the call. Just take a minute here. Hey, Ange, nice to see you. All right, I think let's get started. We're going to start recording after I do this little bit of an introduction, but let me just start by explaining how the format's going to go and what we're going to be doing here today. So, Ulakut, Dr. Heather Gluliukti Uvunga, Tungatsugitsi. Good morning and welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Heather Gliliordi and I'm here on behalf of the Thinking Through the Museum project. We're really grateful to have the folks from the Canadian Museums Association joining us this morning for this conversation. We are going to be in a workshop together this morning. It'll be a 40-minute presentation to start, followed by a Q&A session until 11:30. So you can put your questions in the chat at any time, or raising your digital hands. You can also directly message Alex Robichaud if you'd like to ask a question anonymously. But we're going to go through the presentation with our guests this morning, and then there'll be some time for Q&A. So I'm really glad that we're having this conversation. I think that this is something that is very key to our interests as Thinking Through the Museum. I'll also note that this coming fall in Halifax in October, the Thinking Through the Museum Partnership Grant is joining in partnership with the Native American Art Studies Association Conference. And in Halifax, we're going to be holding a special day during the NASA conference, NASA with 2 A's and not like NASA like space. We're going to be holding a special day of panels and conversations that are really focused around the future of museology. You know, we're about 30 years on from what in Canada was a huge museological crisis that emerged from the Spirit Sings controversy. And that period also around the do I say this? Can I say this word right? Quincentennial of the so-called arrival of Columbus to North America in the early 1990s really sparked a period of intense and inward investigation for institutions and for the people that they hold, for the peoples whose collections they hold in trust. And so I think now that we're 30 years on and re-examining this, and the Canadian Museum Association, of course, tasked by the TRC's calls to actions to really examine and take a critical look at where museums are now. This is really exciting for us because I think we all are incredibly interested in seeing where we're going. There's a lot of work left to be done. There's so many strides that have been taken. And I think Thinking Through the Museum is really invested in participating and understanding these next steps. So we're really thrilled to have Stephanie and Rebecca with us here today. Stephanie Daniluk is the CMA Senior Manager, Community Engagement and Indigenous Initiatives. She has an MA in history, is a public historian and researcher with extensive experience in community engagement, supporting Indigenous heritage and governance initiatives. Good morning, Stephanie. And Rebecca McKenzie is the CMA, sorry. because he's the CMA Director of Communications. The BA in History and Art History is a communications and design profession of Acadian, Blackfoot, Métis, and Scottish descent. She has previously worked in Indigenous and settler communication roles in both the museum and private sectors. And so we're really, really grateful to them for being here with us this morning. And I'm going to let me just make sure that I've given you all the information that you need. Everyone is muted. You can raise your hand. You can ask a question in the chat. You can ask a question in the using the question Q&A feature. Do we have Q&A, Alex? I might be wrong about that.
No, we don't. It's not a webinar, so just the chat.
Okay, so just put your questions in the chat. And you can send anonymous questions to, as it says in the chat, to Rebecca Friend via direct message. Okay. All right, we are really excited for everyone to be here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over and I'll see you in the Q&A period.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much on behalf of the Canadian Museums Association for gathering here today virtually to hear more about a report that we released last September, Move to Action. And this is the CMA's official response to Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action number 67. And so I'm just going to start for passing it over to my colleague, Stephanie Daniluk, by introducing the report a little bit. But first, I would just like to quickly acknowledge and importantly acknowledge that the CMA and our secretariat is located on the unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, by which I'm related to through marriage. And but more than that, and that's very important. Also important is that as a national organization, that we need to reflect and consider our impact on Indigenous people all over in the land known as Canada, and that includes Inuit, Métis, and First Nations communities, and urban Indigenous and urban people who have been separated from the communities through colonization. And that's work we take very, very seriously here at the CMA, and hopefully comes through in the report that we produced. And so it's very important, I think, working nationally that we have that sensitivity. I just wanted to acknowledge that. So, as I mentioned, the Move to Action report is a response to call to action number 67, which is we call upon the federal government to provide full funding to the Canadian Museums Association to undertake, in collaboration with Aboriginal peoples, a national review of museum policies and best practices to determine the level of compliance with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and to make recommendations. And that came out in 2015, and we began this project in 2018, is sort of when it started to come to fruition. We were able to gather and get funding and commence. The report took about 3.5 years to come together, and it was under the authoritative guidance and advisory of the Reconciliation Council. Now, this council took a number of permutations over the 3.5 years. A few of these members are original, but this is the current composition of the council as it stands right now. And as you can see, is a diverse group of Indigenous and occasionally non-Indigenous museum professionals and cultural heritage professionals that have a lot of guidance and wisdom to offer us in this project. What we essentially tried to build with the Move to Action report was we were supposed to assess museum policies across the country. Now, the fact remained, when we first started looking into this earlier on into the project, that we basically found almost immediately that there weren't many. And so then the work had to turn. And essentially what we were trying to produce with this report is what we call a new national baseline of support. And so the last national baseline that was developed on this topic was in 1992 with a task force report on museums and First Peoples, which was a collaborative report issued by the Canadian Museums Association and the Assembly of First Nations in response to spirit sings and the controversy that came out of that, as Heather mentioned previously. Now, since that report was issued in 1992, almost 30 years, well, it was 30 years exactly between that and this new report, Move to Action. But in between that, obviously two notable additional reports were issued, which was the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and the calls to action. And so what needed to happen was you need to sort of take this 1992 report and recast its intention through these 2 additional reports and bring it into a modern practice scenario. And so now I'm going to pass things over to Stephanie to talk a little bit about how we did that and what are some of the steps we took.
Yeah, so in addition to, thinking through the implications of UNDRIP and the TRC report, we also needed to hear from communities and experts in the area. And so, pardon me, I just need to clear my throat. I'm suffering from a cold. And so what the CMA did was held a variety of listening circles and roundtables coast to coast to coast, some with Indigenous communities only, some in conjunction with museums and their Indigenous partners, to hear from folks on the ground and in community about what their concerns, interactions, and recommendations are for museums. In light of the lack of policy, et cetera, like Rebecca just explained. So there's a number of those that you can look to our CMA website to see the graphic recordings of those, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And then we also conducted interviews with experts, Indigenous experts mostly, and in the heritage sector, to really drill down a little bit into what we were hearing from community. And then we solicited written submissions from the museum community, and also conducted a fairly large survey that was completed in 2018. And then we kind of looked at those survey results, identified what we called promising institutions, about 70 or 80 of those, and then developed what we called KPIs, so key performance indicators, on UNDRIP, and assessed the museums based on these key performance indicators. And all that really exciting stuff, if you're a wonk like me, is found in the methodology section of the report, and you can take a look at the specifics there. We list out a lot of the research outcomes in there. So as I mentioned, there are these really beautiful graphic recordings that were taken at each of the roundtables and listening circles that were held, all available bilingually on our website. And what they were meant to do is to make a record of the discussions in a way that also anonymized the discussions. And so they really do reflect, the specific words and in many ways beyond the words of what was discussed at each of those tables. So I encourage you to take a look at those as well. So we heard from Indigenous communities. We also talked to the museum community through these roundtables, but that also held some really specific small museum listening circles or roundtables. So heard from small museums, like, what are your challenges, or what are your unique, what's what I'm looking for? Unique abilities, I guess, that you have when you're kind of trying to support self-determinations in these small museum spaces. There, I got that out. All right, on to you, Rebecca. You're muted. Still muted.
Thank you, Rebecca. Other Rebecca, no, the mute button was like right under where I could not click, and I love that for me. Okay, so what that essentially led to, so Stephanie led a significant portion of that research when she came on board with the program. And what essentially that led into was us realizing that after hearing all of this information, gathering this information and assessing and synthesizing this information, that what had sort of emerged was a new standard list of what museums should and can be doing. And so that is reflected in this new standards for museums. And the list of standards for museums is 30 long. But I would like to just take this opportunity to say that it isn't intended that every museum will necessarily be reflecting every standard. It's intended to be broken down into these 30 standards so that you can take the piece that you can impact and move forward on it. And with the goal of eventually reflecting all of the standards that make sense for the institution in which a person might work. But it's one of those things where we're trying to be comprehensive, and that was something that the council had reflected to us that they really, really liked, is that we erred on the side of being comprehensive instead of general. So comprehensive and specific. In addition to that, we were also asked by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to make recommendations. And we acknowledged that the recommendations in this case are both reflected through the standards for the museums, but also that there was some work that needed to be done outside of the museum in order to create an environment in which museums would be able to effectively do this work, and in which Indigenous communities would be able to effectively support this work being done, given that it's not necessarily their work to do, but rather to have done with their consent and engagement. So we also engage these recommendations. The first three are really centered around, and they're sort of in an order of where they potentially have the most impact in moving this work forward. And so the biggest thing that we heard from related to repatriation. And so we have the recommendations around meeting legislation to support repatriation and funding, as well as better financial support and core financial support for Indigenous cultural centers and Indigenous-led national heritage organizations. This is definitely a significant roadblock, both for us and the work that we did, as well as within museums. When Indigenous communities aren't well funded to engage in this work, it is almost impossible to have them be able to meaningfully work with you on a project, because they just won't have the capacity. And we can't do things without them, so we need them supported. Then we also asked for revisions to National Museum Policy, which is currently underway right now, actually, by the Department of Canadian Heritage and the Museums Assistance Program to reflect the outcomes of this report, as well as a series of recommendations that center around basically inserting more of UNDRIP's the determinations of UNDRIP within different areas of museum function and cultural heritage. So that even goes for like existing laws like the Canada Charities Act and subsequent provincial acts, assessing those, because all of those have an impact on how museums function. Oh, and then I had bigger slides on this, which cool. So that essentially is also reflected in the report sections, which Stephanie is going to speak to, start speaking to in a more specific way. But we were essentially able to summarize the historical considerations for museums and their role in colonization and how we've come to be at the situation that we're currently in, as well as sections on repatriation, which by far and away was the most important subject matter for Indigenous community members that participated in the engagement for the program. Then we moved to engagement and partnership, which was definitely the top of mind for the non-Indigenous community members that participated in and provided context for the program. And we also wanted to talk about governance and operations, with the intention being that no matter what you do as it relates to museums, that one of these sections will likely engage you and the work that you're doing, because it is really going to take the work of everyone who works in and is affected by museums to engage the UNDRIP and make sure that it's flowed through all of our practices.
So I'm going to speak a bit to the first few sections. Actually, Rebecca, do you mind just going forward one slide? I think I put these in, not quite. Nope, one more. So we begin the report by setting out this historical context, we called it historical considerations. And this really was a recommendation of the council. They really wanted to see this grounded in historical context, not only, to reflect the kind of genocidal policies and practices of the colonial powers over time, but also to reflect the impact of the professionalization of the museum sector on Indigenous heritage, and then also to show the rise of Indigenous museology in spite of all of this. And so that's what that section sets out to do. And it's got a pretty fulsome description of these areas, as well as a nice timeline. So linking all to, these areas of the report. So as Rebecca mentioned, repatriation was, oh, sorry, I want to go back to, thanks. You got it. I read my mind. Repatriation was top of mind for Indigenous communities and professionals who we spoke to. And we really wanted to set out that, through the lens of UNDRIP, this is rights-based. This isn't a, decision to be made. This isn't a question of whether or not to repatriate. By adopting federal legislation on UNDRIP, repatriation is now a necessity. So there's the 2 articles related to repatriation from UNDRIP that start out the section. And recognizing also that, repatriation may be the legal term, but rematriation is also a term that's broadly used to reflect bringing back, knowledge and the process. And so you see that there. Do you want to go to the next slide? So there were 3 recommendations specifically linked to repatriation, and Rebecca's kind of talked about these already, so I won't belabor this, but this is, really how important repatriation is, but it's also linked not only to, the giving back of Indigenous belongings and ancestors, but also requires investment in communities and building capacity in communities, and also infrastructure in Indigenous communities in order to have an equitable and complete process. Indigenous communities, we heard, want to bring their belongings home, but they don't have a place often to house them in a way that they'd like. So investment is required there. We heard a lot about the dismantling of Indigenous knowledge through, the removal of not just belongings, but also, recordings of traditional knowledge, that kind of thing, in ways that these have been dissected out and kind of parsed throughout the GLAM sector. And so one of our recommendations, one of the standards, is that the GLAM sector work together in order to bring back reverse the epistemicide and bring back Indigenous knowledge to communities, give back Indigenous knowledge to the communities. Jessie Loya really said it when she said, how heartbreaking it is to think about why Indigenous communities today are struggling to articulate their Indigenous knowledge and having them, in so many different areas that you have to go search for them, and why is the onus on communities to do this? So putting that onus back on museums, which brings me to the next slide, and something, one of my favorite quotes in the report, which is that repatriation is not reconciliation, but it's the job of museums. And so we really want to reframe this, narrative. Like I said, it's a rights-based. These are, you're returning the belongings to the rights holders. Something we also heard, and that is reflected in UNDRIP, is that Indigenous belongings aren't just items, but it's really an expansive list of things, and it includes, like I said, all aspects of Indigenous traditional knowledge. So maps, sound recordings, anything that has Indigenous intellectual property, archival documents, of course, but also songs, plants, seeds, language recordings, etc. So we need a really expansive description and a definition of what's to be considered for repatriation. Something that the council also highlighted is this concept of duress. And so, for many institutions who reflect this in their policies or practices, they consider the the period of duress to be, say, from the implementation of the Indian Act up until 1950, when some of the more substantial Indian Act changes were made. And what we heard is that the period of duress really starts with colonization, with contact, and continues for a lot of communities to today. And so when you're thinking through the ethical responsibilities to repatriate belongings and ancestors to communities, and you're thinking about duress as this ethical reason behind it, that you need to think about, this long period of time when you're considering this, but also there's a second layer here in that aligning with UNDRIP, this really does become rights-based and connected to the idea of pre, prior, and conformed. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. Free, prior, and informed consent. And I think in many cases that was not given. And so there's another impetus there to repatriate. Of course, we heard about, most often from the museum side, the problems with identifying provenance and just the collections management side of things. And so the real recommendation here is that museums work to get their collections in order to better facilitate repatriation, so that if that you can be proactive in repatriating, and that your policies also reflect this. So providing that access and in a way that is making sure that your collections are respectfully cared for and maintained, and the information is given freely to communities. We heard a lot about for Indigenous museum professionals, just the intense emotional labor that it takes to come into collections and to see belongings and ancestors not properly cared for in a way that fits with protocol and considers ceremony and things like that. And so just wanting to highlight this here, that in many cases museum workers still aren't aware of that emotional experience, and a lot of consideration needs to be given to respectfully caring for belongings. Finally, this one of the major kind of next steps for the CMA is supporting Indigenous-led national framework on repatriation. And actually, since we've released the report, we've heard a bit more reflection on what this means. And in our recommendations, we say it's strong legislation. But since then, we've heard, this could look quite different. It could be a policy framework, but a federally led policy framework. No matter what, it needs to come with resources and money to communities and capacity building in communities. So right now, the issue is that each museum has their own policy, and they're vastly different, and the approach is vastly different. So if a community is looking to get some of their belongings back, they have to connect to each individual museum, find out what it is, what their individual process is, that kind of thing. So by establishing a federal framework, this will establish a national baseline that I said comes with resources, investment in communities, and ensures a more equitable approach, because right now things are really happening ad hoc. Even at the federal level, we've heard there's assistance for repatriation, but it's not being approached in an ethical manner. Let's just say that. Okay, I think that's it for me for repatriation, I feel like. Now on to engagement. So as Rebecca said, where repatriation was #1 for Indigenous communities, engagement was front of mind for non-Indigenous museums working with, or seeking to work with communities, or already working with communities, wondering why. What can they do? How can they do this better? Why is what they're doing sometimes not working? Heard that a lot. And so I think the thing to really remember here is both of these UNDRIP articles, but I'll particularly highlight 35 right now, which is that Indigenous people have the right to determine the responsibilities of individuals to their communities. So for thinking of this as the underpinnings of engagement and partnership, what does that mean? And how does that change the current consultation approach? Just checking my notes here. Yes, so, you know, not museum driven in any way, and not driven by museums, projects and programs, etc., but seeking, you know, community guidance first. You want to go to the next slide, I think. And this is something I actually really had to unlearn myself, is this engagement framework. I came from more of an academic background, I guess. And as I was working in an Indigenous community, saw many ways that framework was quite extractive. It's really based still in a resource sector approach, and it needs to be moving beyond consultation, checking a box, and towards this long-term partnership building. So, you know, I think one of the things we heard in our engagements is that the amount of times that communities get cold calls in the summertime to set up a TP camp, for example, is still quite shocking. And so I'm not saying anyone here is doing that, but that was a surprise, I think, to us to even hear the extent that these one-off requests are being made. And so how can we reapproach this in a way that's Indigenous-led and community responsive, that really deprioritizes institutional timelines and invests back into communities and offers the right of refusal? We all know that most Indigenous communities are operating way beyond their capacity because, well, for so many reasons. And so really need to offer the opportunity to say no. Here's a wonderful quote from Heather that talks about non-extractive partnerships, and it really hits the nail on the head. So that, you know, investment in community collaboration needs to happen, formulating recommendations directly with communities, and leaving capacity behind in communities. So the connections need to become institution to nation, you know, and you'll see that reflected in UNDRIP as well. So how do you build long-term partnerships? We've heard the use of MOUs, of ceremony and other kinds of Indigenous protocols that still has flexibility baked into that. So beyond the one-time request and going beyond the museum walls. So going outside of museums, going to communities, thinking first again, what they're doing and what they need, and helping in that way. A great quote about thinking about the museum not as a permanent space, but a temporary camp within a traditional territory from our Yukon Roundtable, and Mary Jane Johnson gave us that. And then this also involves reevaluating compensation. So if your requests aren't for one-off kind of box ticking engagements, if you're thinking about a long-term partnership and framework, how can you also make sure that this position, or like how can you maybe create a position? How can you make this a part of your institutional framework and your operations? And I think Rebecca will speak to that a little bit more. And what does that mean then for folks who are now working in your museum rather than just being consulted by the museum? And this is the final slide, and then I'll turn it over to Rebecca to speak to the final two sections of the report. But this is really kind of summarizing what we heard. So centering and supporting the needs and interests of Indigenous communities is key. And this comes with the proper resources and an assessment of the long-term capacity and ability of the institution to do so. So making sure that those resources are there multi-year before really making requests. And, you know, doing so with ceremony and following the proper protocols if that's the wish of the nation that you are working with, and just making sure that it's an ongoing reciprocal relationship, and that reciprocity is hard, you know, and it takes time, and that's what we heard the most, is the time is important, that investment in time. Okay, on to you, Rebecca.
Great.
Okay, yeah, so as Sonia mentioned, I'm going to be covering the governance and operations sections, which are inextricably linked together, but generally kind of carried out by slightly different people within an organization. And so that's why we sort of have them as separate entities within the report. So when it comes to governance, we reference most expressly under article number 31.1, which is about essentially sharing authority. And it says Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions, as well as the manifestations of their sciences, technologies, and cultures, including human and genetic resources, seeds, and all of the things that Stephanie was mentioning in terms of having this expansive definition of belongings. They also have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their intellectual property over such cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions. And it's that last sentence that I think is extremely important when we're discussing governance, because it essentially states that not only should they be controlling the belongings themselves, but then also what happens to those belongings. And it all kind of comes part and parcel, it comes together. It's a group. And you can't separate it. And so some of the important facts that come around this when we were doing the KPI research in our 2019 survey as part of developing this report is that approximately, and these were in non-Indigenous museums that were being assessed here. So that's who's speaking to these things. So 5% of respondents shared instances where staff efforts on decolonizing were hindered by the museum board of directors. And that was just part of this survey, but also we heard within our sessions, particularly the small museum sessions, that this is an ongoing and much more widespread concern. So where we are seeing a lot of blockages in terms of doing better work when it comes to engaging in the articles of UNDRIP in the museum space, it is sometimes and often coming from that governance level, either lack of understanding, lack of support being demonstrated, and often a mixture of all of them. So it's very important to get the board on board, so to speak. 73% of museums showcase Indigenous programming, but only 10 have mandated or operationalized Indigenous initiatives. And this doesn't necessarily 100% mean that there's something extractive going on, but it's often a pretty good indicator that if you haven't operationalized your relationship, where the relationship between the community that you work with and the institution is strong and part of many facets of your institution's operation, but yet you're doing Indigenous programming, how is that fitting? How is that supporting the community, leaving resources within the community? How is that supporting the community within your space and to the community and to the broader non-Indigenous community that you might be serving in terms of your audience? So just something to watch for. And then 10% of institutions publicly indicated that these operations were guided by Indigenous advisory bodies or the presence of Indigenous board directors. So that's another area of concern, is that means 90% potentially aren't having Indigenous people participate in an advisory way or an authoritative way. And that's something that needs to change. And so the term that we kind of transferred over, borrowed to kind of illustrate this in a way that we felt non-Indigenous museum professionals could relate to was authoritative guidance, which is something that we borrowed from accounting principles. And essentially what that means is it means that those who are providing authoritative guidance on a project have final control over the processes and outcomes for any policy or project over which they are presiding. Often, we see this in museum spaces through the role of the executive director as an example. So they often have some of the final say. The buck stops there. So we want to see Indigenous community members and advisory bodies having that final say, that control, even when inconvenient, even when a problem, even when it creates other problems. We need to respect that authoritative guidance of that group, and we need to be following their lead, so to speak, when it comes to matters of their cultural sovereignty and self-determination. So part of this also means that we need to start undoing systemic barriers within the institution. And what that can look like is a couple of things. One is understanding your museum's decision-making processes and authoritative structures. And this doesn't even apply just to museums, it can apply to universities as well. But it's essentially, how do decisions get made within your institution? Who currently holds that role of authoritative guidance? Because there's always someone or a group that ultimately gets to say yes or no to something moving forward or something stopping or any decision that gets made. And so we need to understand who those people are and how they come to make those decisions and how we can start to replace that function with Indigenous leadership where it makes sense to.
Then we need to put methods in place through bylaws, internal policies that center that Indigenous authority. So it's not just doing this even off book or by doing a lot of like something I've seen a lot is you're constantly trying to have like that meeting before the meeting. You have to go and talk to that person before you have this in place. You need to put all your pieces together. How can we reduce that additional labor that we put on ourselves to make space within our institutions by creating that space directly within our bylaws and internal policies, so that it's no longer a question of having to gain someone's support. It's a matter of it currently exists this way and we have to do it this way because our policies say so. And then this all leads to responding and dismantling these systemic barriers within our institution. So where we do have Indigenous professionals working within an institution, what is blocking them from having authority? Just because someone is not, first of all, why is there maybe not an Indigenous person in a director position or in a position of leadership within an institution? But then even in situations where that doesn't necessarily exist, maybe a smaller institution, what's stopping that Indigenous staff person or that Indigenous community member from having an authoritative role over things that relate to their community or to indigeneity? So I think it's important to remove those systemic barriers, think a little bit more flat, and think of leadership not as a position of authoritativeness, but of facilitation. And that's really important. So we see a couple of great quotes here. So working down instead of being at the bottom, working up is important. We need to see leaders take this on and to acknowledge their own limitations in doing this work. And then how does your museum benefit from systemic racism? Because sometimes it can be really, really easy to take all the wonderful parts of reconciliation, those parts where you get those big press wins, you make those beautiful exhibitions, but then you're benefiting from systemic racism when it's easy to sort of cast someone aside because they've been labeled as difficult to work with, even though they might be speaking some very real truth about more internal processes that are causing harm. And it's the work of individuals together. And so this really requires everyone's participation from every role at every level. I cannot say this more straightforwardly, but UNDRIP is everyone's job. We are all treaty people is a term I've heard, and that's not technically true because some Indigenous communities haven't signed treaty, but it's the same sentiment, which is that we all need to take a role. And so no matter what role you have, how can you use your voice? How can you use your actions to support the implementation of UNDRIP and support Indigenous self-determination and sovereignty within your work, and hold each other up? So for Indigenous people in the audience, including me, how can we hold each other up? How can we support each other in engaging this work, especially when it becomes harmful? And all levels of museums hierarchy need to be empowered. I know when I'm talking about museums specifically, security guards, food services people, we all need to work on these things. No one left behind, right? We all need to be empowered to work on these things and to move forward. And strengthen your peer networks and hold each other accountable. So for Indigenous professionals, it looks like holding each other up, boosting each other and lifting each other. And then for non-Indigenous peer networks and mixed ones, it's holding each other to accountability. Trying to reduce this reaction that can come through when we feel threatened by something, and maybe asking ourselves, why do I have these feelings? So these are some of the things that come out of the work, and this is something that we've been asked for, in these community engagements, and something that I'll be quite honest, even I had to go through, working through this project where the council would basically hold me accountable for something that I had to respond to, and I had to question my own thoughts and feelings around, why were they responding in this way, and how can we adjust and adapt? So it's part of a museum advisory committee. So we see this quote from Museum Le Demestresh. As part of a museum advisory committee, I can share my knowledge from my home territory. So it's important, this idea of making space for knowledge to be shared. And understand that will always be the case, that there will always, we always need to make space for sharing of knowledge. And then this meaningful Indigenous advisory. So this can be basically sort of given through bylaw, policy, memorandums of understanding. We've also seen, since the report came out, a lot of Indigenous museum professionals that are having a lot of success within their non-Indigenous institutions. It's often because, regardless of their position, they have a direct line to the executive director. So they've been given that access to the authoritative structures of their institutions. And it also includes thinking, as Stephanie mentioned, the engagement part, that thinking beyond museum walls. So it's how can then we use our role as a museum, as a public institution in the community to then advocate for more space to be created in other areas, like in provincial or federal law. I mean, we have UNDRIP at the federal level, we have it in BC, but we don't have it in so many countless other provinces, and we kind of need it to be in place from a legal perspective in a lot of other places in order for the action to truly be engaged. And another quote from Crane Duhamel here, that recognizing Indigenous peoples as rights holders, as sovereign, with their own governance systems and laws is often not applied or looked to in a museum context. As Stephanie had mentioned, institution to nation relationship building, and I often call this working intranationally, recognizing that there are many nations within the geographical boundaries of what we know as Canada, and that we need to act accordingly. And it requires moving towards shared authority, stewardship, and co-development. And then about this community building piece. So we talked a little bit about this in the engagement part. We talked a lot about that not being extractive. It's about using your voice and role as a community organization to proactively support Indigenous-led cultural heritage organizations, cultural centers, museums, ensuring that where you're able to make use of any privileges you have, that's being extended to people that you want to see succeed, that we actually need to succeed to engage this work, and to avoid practices that undermine their development and success. And so something like this can look like, you know, applying for grant funding that is earmarked for Indigenous projects, but yet your Indigenous component of your project isn't very sound, isn't actually connected to community. Why isn't it the community that's applying to be the fund holder? Unless they told you, because I don't want to be, we want you to do this. Maybe think about that, right? So these are some of the questions that come up in the context of the work. And then with operations, which is kind of, I already started to speak to this, it's this idea everything depends on everything else. And I'm just going to point to specifically UNDRIP Article 17.3, which is Indigenous individuals have the right not to be subjected to any discriminatory conditions of labor, inter alia employment, or salary. And this also extends to their right to be comfortable in museum spaces. And so when we look at operations, again, implementing UNDRIP is everyone's job, and we need to integrate into the whole of museum operations, not siloed into a department, staff position, or policy. We can have Indigenous people leading this work through positions that have a focus in the Indigenous areas of concern for museum, but it doesn't mean the work solely falls to them. I hear a lot from a Reconciliation Council member and someone who mentors to me, Luann Neal. She talks a lot about brown questions and this concept of whenever anyone has any questions at all considering indigeneity or Indigenous value systems, regardless of the community that they might be concerning or what have you, they always turn to that Indigenous person in the room. And that puts a lot of unpaid labor onto that individual. That's not their responsibility to do that. And that was actually something that the original report in 1992 called for people to do, which we are now taking a complete turn and saying, do not do that anymore. Try Googling it first. Is usually a good step that we now ask people to kind of do within the context of the report, which I'm sure feels right for many of you here today. So then, and then with labor and hiring practices, are we adequately compensating everything that Indigenous professionals are bringing to the table when they come and work within institutions and work in either consulting capacity or as permanent staff or part-time staff? Are we acknowledging and compensating the fact that they're bringing with them all of that ancestral knowledge, community connections, responsibilities to their community? Oftentimes, Indigenous museum professionals have responsibility to their community that has to be held in and above their responsibility to their work at the museum, and we need to have respect for that and space for that. Incorporating into the job description relevant ways that Indigenous knowledge, skills, and perspectives are important for success in the role. And even beyond that, for non-Indigenous people, do we have UNDRIP in everybody's job description? Do we require that to be an area of knowledge that people hold when they come into any job, no matter what it is? And I would encourage people to do that. And to say museums need to hire more Indigenous peoples, not necessarily people with BAs, MAs, or PhDs. And those are important skills, but also people with the cultural knowledge. And sometimes those people are one and the same, and sometimes they are not. And we need to have a lot more value for cultural knowledge, potentially over academic credentials. And so then when we move to creating museums as welcoming spaces, so this is when we don't necessarily have Indigenous people. We're not talking about people who are currently hired or employed by the institution, but also Indigenous people that come to engage in your museum space and with your collection, and so community members. And museums have a duty to provide Indigenous visitors with spaces that are not only free from discrimination, but also brave and ethical. So when you're tackling Indigenous content, are you tackling in a way that considers the fact that Indigenous community members might be part of that experience? Do you have culturally safe spaces? Do you have spaces where they can go to process and be supported? You know, are we creating an environment where we, you know, security guards are ready to engage if there's potentially like other visitors who are saying, you know, discriminatory or racist things in the presence of Indigenous people, and how are we tackling those things, you know, at all levels? And that museum spaces should center community needs and be inclusive of children, youth, and elders. And this is something that goes far, far beyond even just you know, relationship building with Indigenous communities. These are really good principles for all museums to engage in. Bring the whole community through the door. Senator Patricia Bobby, who's been a big ally for the museum sector, you know, is really known for saying that families don't go to schools together, they go to museums together. And so we bring that that in here as well. And do we have space for ceremony? So are Indigenous people able to smudge in museum spaces? In often cases, no, or not without very weird fire policies where you've got some random guy standing at the back with like a bucket. Really looking at those policies around how can we better incorporate ceremony into our spaces. And we also want to see authentic representation. And so I don't know if there's anyone here who comes from a comms or marketing space like me, but this is something that is very, very important to reflect, not just within the exhibits, which I think we give a lot of time and attention, but also in the marketing and the other representations of museum operations. So nothing about us without us. This phrase that we see time and time again. Without consent, any use of Indigenous intellectual property is counter to UNDRIP and should not be used or presented. Consider funding, revenue sharing, and community impact as well. So how are we utilizing the funds that we generate from Indigenous-led activities, or from activities that are utilizing Indigenous resources and belongings? Are we making, you know, are we clarifying like how we can potentially revenue share that fund? Are we creating impact for the community? Are we putting resources into the community? And also, when we're promoting these things, do we have the consent of the community? Are we promoting the community in a good way? Something I see often is imagery that just gets pulled by some marketing person and used completely out of context to promote an institution or institutional endeavor. That's not good. We don't want to be doing that. We want to be contextualizing our images, and we want to be having consent from our images, and not just of the photographer, but of the community, of the individuals who are present in those images. And so making a plan for that. And you know, going to the Burnaby Village Roundtable, everyone needs to see themselves when they come into a museum. And it's important that we really take that responsibility, not just to create more representation within spaces, but also authentic representation. You know, I can speak to a time working within the Museum of Anthropology, giving tours to students. We're having a lot of Indigenous young people come in and engage with their culture in that space. And what we need to have is authentic representation of that culture, so that we aren't giving, you know, Indigenous youth the wrong impression of their culture and how we value it, but then also for non-Indigenous people to come in and see that authentic representation that is community-led, and how Indigenous youth see themselves. Representation is very important. And so to kind of finish off this part, and we're running a couple minutes over time, just to point to a few resources and next steps. So we do have move to action toolkits available on our site for anyone who's kind of doing work in this space. There's many toolkits that we're developing. We're about to release a couple more within the next month and a half or so. So keep an eye open for those. And Stephanie, I'm just going to leave you to speak a little bit to the next steps in terms of what we're engaging in for the recommendations.
Yes, I already spoke to the repatriation framework, and so that's something that we're moving forward in the next while. And then we're also looking into supporting recommendation number 9, this National UNDRIP Professional Development Strategy, and as part of that, including some course curriculum material that's based on the Move to Action report and the resources. And so might be just wanted to kind of put that out there, and maybe seeking input, etc., in the future from folks like you. So yeah, thanks.
Please stay in touch with us. So just the question to say, please email us, come to the website, stay in touch, even if it's just to say hi, read the report. We love to hear from people. It's really sometimes difficult doing this work. You feel it's a bit in a vacuum. So it really means a lot to us when people reach out.
Nakomi, thank you so much, Rebecca and Stephanie. That was a lot of information packed into 45 minutes of talk. So I'm very impressed. You've clearly been doing this lots. Like I can see as the slides come up where the things are that you're like, oh, I personally feel I'm like feeling this one a lot. I just like, knowing that you have done this presentation a little bit, I just want to start us with the first question is where do you think the most resistance is going to come from in the coming years in terms of, members of CMA and other museums? And what do you are you most excited about? And then we've got some questions in the chat. I'll just say, so Rebecca is putting some instructions on how to ask questions if you'd like. Again, if you want to ask a question anonymously, you just send your question directly to Rebecca Friend. She's in the chat, not Rebecca McKenzie. And Rebecca will then post your question anonymously. I can see that some people are already posting. Right now, there is a feedback poll that we're going to open up in the chat. And or not in the chat, there's a feedback poll on the bottom of your screen under polls and quizzes. And at the end of the Q&A period at 11:30, we're going to give you an opportunity to please fill in the poll and give us a little bit of feedback. This is a really highly attended workshop, and I can see that it's a lot of people who are doing the kind of work that we are all critically engaging with. We're really, really happy to see you all on the call. So please give us some feedback. The other thing that I'll do is that we'll post right at the end so that everybody can see it at the end of the call, our Thinking Through the Museum newsletter. If you want to subscribe, you can jump onto the link that we'll post at the end of this. Also, that call for papers that is highly relevant to our conversation today at the Native American Art Studies Association in mid-October in Halifax is open right now. And we have a call for papers for that special day of Thinking Through the Museum NASA partnership. So I'm going to put that in the chat right at the end of the call as well. So stick around at 11:30 to finish the poll, see the links, check out more of Thinking Through the Museum. But for now, I can see the questions are coming, and Stephanie and Rebecca. So my first question, what do you think is going to be the biggest challenge, and what are you most excited about? I'll go Stephanie first.
Well, we had a Hill Day last week, and I'm speaking specifically to the repatriation aspect of things. And we had an opportunity to speak with a variety of MPs, and I think the biggest challenge is going to be the quantification that happens when you start to talk about this work. And we saw it reflected actually in the media coverage of the report release as well. And everybody starts, the first question people jump to is cost. And without thinking about, the cost of not doing the work, the cost of an action, but also the cost to communities and what that means and what investment means in communities, and so I think getting over that kind of what might be for some museums, a scarcity mindset, and for the government hesitance to invest in communities and repatriation in this way is, I think, going to be a big challenge.
I think if I had to speak to a challenge, I really agree with Stephanie. I think that's a very succinct representation of a challenge. I think another challenge that exists, is just more because I deal within public relations and this communications end of it, but I think it's also going to be like the sort of perceived political will of the Canadian public that continues to be a challenge and also an opportunity. Following the grave recoveries in Kamloops, we saw a complete change in tone towards support for the kind of work that's being engaged and reflected in the report. And honestly, even within our own institution and within our own membership, I see a lot of people more able to speak out and feel like they're going to be supported. And so I think it's not to take that for granted. I think to continue to be loud and verbal and as loud as people can be about their support for this work, because there's also very, very loud people who are speaking against this kind of work. And I don't think that they form the majority. But I do think that when we're talking about politics and political will, we need to ensure that the voice in support of self-determination and UNDRIP is louder. because that is something. And actually, I see a question in the chat that kind of speaks to that a little bit. So maybe we'll get to there from Trina.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and invite Trina to ask her own question. I think I click actually unmute. Hi, Trina.
Hi, great presentation. Thank you so much. So the question I wanted to ask, and I'm just sort of looking through the methodology quickly, was how Article 8.2 and 15.2 of UNDRIP was evaluated. So how you determined whether museums do or do not have any responsibility with respect to these two articles of the UNDRIP. And just I put in the chat, Article 8.2 speaks to the obligations of states to prevent and redress a list of items that collectively one could describe as forms of cultural genocide. And 15.2 states obligations to combat prejudice and intolerance. Was there any consideration to develop a recommendation for museums to develop policies to enact those obligations?
Yeah, so I want to be, I'm going to kind of answer this in pieces. So the first piece I want to talk about is in terms of the context of the report, we do recognize a few times that all of UNDRIP does apply, and we tried to pick out the articles of UNDRIP that are the most relevant for museum function. Parts of, and what you're kind of referencing here, definitely I think you're tying a very good link between, and thank you for such a thoughtful and like specific question. It's really nice to get that kind of like in-depth questioning. We don't often get it. What I would say is I think it comes out in parts of our report that we do want museums, especially when I talked just recently, right now about brave and welcoming spaces within museums, that museums need to be representative of these kind of, and using their voice to proactively speak in support of these things. I think in addition to that though, why we maybe didn't get as far as you might be sort of referencing on this is because museums also, it needs to be said, have work to do. And something that I don't think would make sense in a lot of ways is for museums to take a leadership role or any type of proactive role in setting up these kinds of policies before they've had this opportunity to connect with the communities. They need to be like lifting Indigenous community voices. And to this point, museums are still, a lot of them anyway, very harmful environments for a lot of Indigenous people. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done before I think they would be able to effectively contribute to those articles in a way that would be meaningful and actually supportive and not just sort of box checky. But that being said, I do really appreciate you sort of highlighting that. I think that's a really good question to ask. And we ask ourselves those questions in museums a lot with climate change too. You know, like what is the role of the museum when it comes to raising awareness around certain issues or taking a strong stance on something. Another report you could look to is the Reconsidering Museums report that was drafted by the Alberta Museum Association, but actually a collaborative effort of all of the museums associations in Canada. And that speaks quite a lot more specifically to museums as activist spaces. I hate to use that word, but it's museums as spaces that essentially are supposed to take a strong leadership position when it comes to matters of equity and justice and speaking out against genocide and things like that. So I could definitely also recommend that report to you, but definitely something I think to consider as we move through this process.
Activism as in doing what you're supposed to do.
Exactly. Yes,
know, like,
that's the new definition of activism that we would like to promote here today.
I'm gonna combine two questions in the chat that are sort of both around funding. One is asking where the funding for this particular project came from, and another asking about funding for the needs for infrastructure and maintenance around Indigenous archaeology repositories, like just the fact that institutions need funding in order to care for these things. And you know, last week I was at a Canadian Public Arts Funders and like institutional funders conference in Ottawa, and there was a lot of anxiety around where the funding to do the decolonial work that needs to be done is going to come from. And one of the questions that one of the moderators posed to the crowd was, if your budget doubled tomorrow, where would you put your priorities? And I hate that question because our budgets are not doubling. Like it's going to have to come out of existing budgets. We're going to have to reprioritize and or redistribute funds. So I'm sure you've had lots of questions around where does the money come from? And I'd love to hear you speak a little bit around funding for institutions to protect culture and to do all the community engagement work, the things that get cut first, basically. How do we avoid them from being the first on the chopping block?
I can speak to that. I think most specifically just to get, I think because one of the questions directly asked, where do we get our funding from? And our funding for this project came from the federal government, as was asked for in the call to action number 67. Since then, we've applied for phase 2 funding through the Museums Assistance Program to continue the work that we're doing, but that is only being funded at 50%. The remaining 50% of that is going to be coming from other sources, including CMA membership dues. So that's kind of to be really transparent about how we fund the work that we do here at the CMA. We also try to be good about working in partnership and making sure that the outcomes of it have a knock-on effect or like a multiplicity effect. When it comes to more generally, I have to say, Heather, I actually don't dislike that question, because even though the budgets aren't doubling tomorrow, I think what it really, really does is it gets people to be really, really honest with themselves about the fact that they don't have their priorities in line in the first place a lot of the time, because you already have the budget you have, but over the course of time and decisions that have been made previously, the budgets are being allocated the way that they're being allocated. And if you were to start over with a budget, is the way that you allocate the budget currently something you would do if you could come completely fresh to something without that sort of baggage of institutional, we've always done it this way, or this is how we think we need to do it. So I think that's really important to say. I'd say one of the ways that we can protect these things is to, as we say, put them into your governance structures. Make sure that they are a core priority for the organization and a top priority for the organization. And so, yeah, when things move into the chopping block, that this isn't the piece that gets considered first is really, really important. That being said, I do agree we need more funding and support, but that's part of it right now. Is be clearly, you might have $100 and you might spend $100 on one thing over another. It's just making space wherever you can to be dedicating more space. But Stephanie?
I just want to add something that we heard that some institutions are doing in some museums, and they are forming networks of non-Indigenous organizations to pool resources and also, lessen the burden on Indigenous communities, because they're coming to them with the same request. So the city of Humboldt in Saskatchewan, where I am right now, I'm in Saskatoon, but in Saskatchewan, is doing just that. And they're coming together with their business bureau folks and the health network and the Office of the Treaty Commissioner, and they're trying to find ways to synthesize that. So
that's really exciting. Yeah, that is exciting to hear that, because it's like, if it's not within the sector, then it has to be multi-sectoral, and the Indigenous work is not just museology or just academic. It's everything, right? It's everything everywhere all at once. So I'm going to go to a new question in the chat. Thank you so much. In Ontario, this is a specific question. Archaeological material in Ontario following a dig must remain as an entire collection. It cannot be split up or picked over. With this in mind, a detailed archaeological dig can reveal artifacts from Indigenous communities to colonial ones. How should museums approach repatriation in a situation like this? Should we be pushing for provincial legislative change?
I can't answer this in any wholesale way, but I will speak to some of the broader discussions that I've heard about this, and that is the development of an Indigenous framework for archaeological digs, and what's the word I'm looking for, where you have to apply the application process for development companies, that kind of thing. So developing an Indigenous-led framework for this exact question for collections management, that kind of thing, specific to archaeology, because it is quite different for museum collections. And I know the folks at the now I'm going to get the name wrong, the U of A Prairie Indigenous Archaeological Institute, and that's not quite the name, but led by Keisha Supranat. They're doing some work in that right now and reevaluating, I think, the Alberta legislation. So there's some movement there.
Rebecca, were you going to add something?
No, nothing. I know that the Canadian Association of Science Centers has this on mind, maybe even a bit more than we do, given that they work with a lot of like more recently gathered natural history, archaeologically based collections. So definitely something to follow up with them too, and to kind of continue the question. But I think overall, this speaks to recommendation, I think number 7 quite accurate, which is yes, push for legislative change, make space for that.
Absolutely. Well, like you've been saying, it has to happen at all levels, and that's inside and outside of the institution. One audience member says, thank you for the great sharing. I'm especially curious about the knowledge sharing part, that how if we face the secret or unique knowledge that owned by a specific family, and how if they have various or even reveal voice in a community. I'm sorry, you want to read the question in the chat? I think there's a word missing. Especially curious about the knowledge sharing part. What if we're facing secret or unique knowledge that's owned by a specific family, and how they have various or even revealed voice in a community?
Yes, might be speaking to, I'm not sure if this is correct, but it might be speaking to this idea, yes, that some knowledge is not for public use. And I think really the ultimate, what the report points to is to confirm and develop these meaningful relationships. And sometimes, maybe this is also kind of touching on the fact that sometimes you can have what you think is a well-connected relationship with an Indigenous person. We sometimes see this worst case scenario where you connected with someone who's a non-Indigenous person posing as an Indigenous person, but it can exist also where you have, community members will have different roles within their community. It's not always consistent or like all organized, and so you've developed a relationship with a person who says they reflect a certain community. They've shared certain things with you. I think ultimately it's just to be careful and understand that you always need to be able to tie that to a specific person or a specific community, and that community is well informed of that information being shared and is participating in it in whatever way that is good for them. As the relationship deepens and expands and becomes, as we mentioned, institutional to nation, these kinds of things become less of a concern because you have more community buy-in and you'll get more guidance that will kind of prevent any sort of, I think, unintentional sharing. If it's just bringing it back to there's objects in collections, so this happens sometimes with various ceremonial objects, and you're not quite sure what to do with them, and maybe someone's come by your museum someday and said, hey, that belongs to my family and that shouldn't actually be displayed, or we don't think that's supposed to be on display. It's probably best to approach that from an area of caution and to take it off display and then ask more questions and ask for more support, and maybe develop a relationship with that person and by extension maybe others to get clarity. But I think Stephanie might have better details or
No, this just made me think of something that we pointed out to the Canadian Cultural Property Export Review Board. They asked us to come do a presentation on what we heard about their specific legislative and policy approaches, and what really wanted to highlight that through their expert review process that they may not be getting all the information about items and belongings because of the secret or sacred knowledge that isn't shared in certain contexts. And so just wanting to think through those protocols and just be aware of them is something that we were also thinking through.
Thank you. One of the questions that I have is that, and I'm sure you've thought about this a lot, is that the big critique from the task force report on museums and First Peoples from 30 years ago was that it was recommendations and not mandated work. And I wrote down a stat that you had, which is like so telling. 73% of museums' key performance indicators showcase their Indigenous programming, like what they're doing right now, yet only 10% have mandated or operationalized it. Like, this to me is going to be the big challenge, is that and I also know that a lot of times when Indigenous peoples enter into relationships with museums, there's almost an expectation that they are coming with their own resources, that there's some kind of a, that they're entering into partnership and it's an extra thing and not it's like a bonus thing and not like the core work of the museum. How do we make this core work for certainly more than 10% of museums in the country?
That can be spoken to in two ways, which both kind of reference back to the title of the report. One is the sort of, I think the way that most people take this report when they see the title is like move to action. You're going to see something, you're going to be compelled, and you're going to act of your own sort of internal reasoning, and you're going to push these ideals forward because they align with your value systems, with your ethical systems, and that's a really key part of it. You can build a lot of momentum that way, and you'll engage in better work when people are sort of mobilized in that way. An old ED of the CMA used to refer to this as like activation energy. So you put a lot of energy into something and then you get a momentum around it. But there is sort of this secondary way that you can read that title, Move to Action. And that is when you physically move people to action, when it becomes no longer a choice that you can engage in, but a requirement. And that is something where we are a bit further ahead over 30 years ago, is because of the implementation of UNDRIP. It doesn't go as far as I think people might perceive it to, but it does have a great impact. So the UNDRIP being implemented at the federal level, it's still being implemented, it's still being rolled out. So it's now in the UNDRIP Act that's been signed on, but now it has to be flowed through all of the existing legislation in Canada, and that can take forever. Potentially, it can also happen never, even though the UNDRIP Act exists. But it does create a mechanism by which we can ask for change in other areas of legislation. Now, federally, that legislation doesn't apply to all museums. It only actually applies to federally regulated museums, but it does apply to federal funding streams. And so what we might find is many museums who find themselves reliant on federal funding to continue their operations will be required to move forward with this. We've also seen at the provincial level, because the CMA does not have an institutional accreditation program, but there are a couple of provinces that do. There are also these situations where you have this institutional accreditation situation where they are starting to adapt and adjust their accreditation programs to implement UNDRIP through the Move to Action report findings. So we are starting to see that happen at the provincial level in a couple of places. And so I think it's important to realize that right now, technically, yes, it is kind of a choice for many museums. However, as we change the standards on our own work and our own expectations of our own work, and also as these legislations come into place, this will be something that we are required to do more and more and more. And so it's better to be on the front end of that, to get comfortable with it and to get on top of it, than it is to sort of wait for it to catch up with you, I think.
Did you want to add anything, Stephanie? Thanks, Rebecca. That was great.
That was a great answer.
Like, that's all of it. It's great. It's good to hear it's coming, and like UNDRIP is what is going to eventually make it a requirement. And so like I just I love that, like, get on board, start doing the work now. There's a question from the audience, and you sort of alluded to it because you talked about how you're going into the next phase of funding from the Museums Assistance Program is a Canadian Heritage Program, of course. And so this ties into that, I think. What's next for CMA in this project? Like, what's the work to come? How are you planning on implementing it in your own operations so we can look forward to?
Yes, so we've talked a little bit about the work ahead, pardon me. So some of that peer network development, additional resource support, as well as the repatriation work. But internal to the CMA, we are working with our Reconciliation Council to make them more of an authoritative guidance body in a way that, isn't siloed to the Move to Action project, but is, woven through all of the CMA. And so that's kind of what's next. And our new executive director, Janice Montour, is leading that. And it will be kind of looking at that soon. Rebecca, I'm losing my voice. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Oh my goodness. Yeah, so we are kind of taking our own advice, so to speak. So, we put up Move to Action. It doesn't mean that CMA follows all of the things as laid out in Move to Action. We, like every non-Indigenous based organization, also have work to do. And I think for us, it's about really seeking the guidance from the council about, and from the community. So we spend a lot of our time also still taking meetings, asking for meetings, trying to speak to whoever will speak to us, who has something to say about this, so that we can get a really good sense of all the pieces that are in play, everything that's going on, all of the work that people are doing in this space, and, you know, get a sense of where it is that the CMA would be best to participate in that. And I use the word participate very, very for a reason, not lead. This is not the CMA's work necessarily to continue to lead. And I would actually even say, in hindsight, looking back over the course of this project and having the project in hand at the outset, you know, the CMA made a lot of missteps in delivering this work, you know, over the course of the 3.5 years that we were working it through, because we aren't an Indigenous-led organization. There's a lot that wasn't known or that wasn't in play at the association throughout. And what I would say is, I think if some of the things that we've asked for in the recommendations already existed, if there were well-funded, well-supported, Indigenous-led, national level heritage organizations, they would have been much more poised to do this work. And I hope in the future that they will lead this work and that we will become a partner of theirs and a supporter of theirs, because it really, I think, even with Indigenous leadership, you know, being with the institution, and Janice now being our executive director, we're still not an Indigenous-led organization, and it's important that we recognize that distinction. So
that is important. Although now you have Janice at the helm, which is incredibly exciting. I met her when I was a master's student 20 years ago, and she was at the Woodland Cultural Center, and she's just incredibly impressive. There's a question here that is, I think, quite interesting. And it's from Bradley Clements. Many thanks for the work. How was the consideration of nation-to-nation treaties factored into the report's research? If so, what emerged from this? This is related to Article 37 of UNDRIP.
I don't know if I can speak research specific, other than the fact that we were thinking through the research approach as kind of a way that recognized and supported self-determination in communities. And, you know, we're trying to think of every aspect of this as rights holder based discussion linked to like Section 35, you know, inherent right to self-government, that kind of thing. I can't speak to any specific treaty like observations or, but I think everything in there, by talking to self-determination and thinking of this beyond the scope of like diversity and inclusion, but like I said, like really linked to the rights-based framework that was present there. Yeah.
Thank you. I think, Stephanie, we might need to have you mime your phone questions. I feel so bad about you being sick and taking this call. Thank you. As we're sort of getting close to the end, I have a question for you both. Just, you know, this is a Thinking Through the Museum hosted workshop today. A lot of the people in the audience are either museum professionals or academics or grad students who are figuring out if they're going to become museum professionals or academics, and or both in the case of someone like myself. So it's like, what do you want this particular audience to take away? What are some things that they can start bringing into their practices right now or into their scholarship that is going to help to move us forward to take that action?
Oh, tough, because I think I'll go back to what I said at the beginning, which is take some time to really consider the report and then work through it in a way that feels right for you and where you're at this moment. You know, there was a lot of discussion around the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, particularly in the last couple of years more succinctly. And I know a lot of my non-Indigenous friends have started to comb through those calls to action and repeatedly visit those calls to action, looking for a way that they can support one from an individual perspective. Now, we're as fortunate as museum professionals, we have this additional layer of support through the Move to Action report. And so I would think, you know, as you're moving through the report, don't feel like you need to read it all at one time, or maybe only one time, you know, like read it a few times, different days, pick it up you know, scan to a page online and read something new about it. And then whatever's kind of resonating for you, and it's going to sound a little hippy dippy or whatever, but I would say whatever's kind of resonating for you, please act on that. And the more that you familiarize yourself with the words of the Indigenous people and communities that participated in this process that are featured all throughout, the more that those words will come to you when you need them, when you're engaging in your work. And so I think to, you know, find that standard that speaks to you and start to implement it, or to at least familiarize yourself so that it comes to you at the right timing. I really believe in that. And it's something that I feel really fortunate to have this whole report almost like memorized in my brain because it comes in handy. But I know, Stephanie, you might have something different to say.
Yeah, I mean, for me as a non-Indigenous person coming to this work, and coming through like kind of an academic setting, I think what John Hampton said when we talked to him for the purposes of the report is that everyone needs to commit to humility in this work. And I think sometimes in our academic settings, that's not always a priority. And it's something that I definitely had to learn when I was working in a community. And I think it's a lesson that I pretty much learned every day, you know, confronted with my own internalized prejudices or just the world's systemic racism that I also internalized. And, you know, you think you get it, and then all of a sudden someone says something, and you're like, no, still don't understand. And so that humility is really important to center, I think, is what I would say.
Thank you both. The last question that came in from Angela Thaler, who of course is one of the cluster coordinators for Thinking Through the Museum, and is an important question because I think it's about thinking through the museum. It's also about all of our work. Is what about the intersections of this work with other concerns of the CMA? Like what can you speak to how the CMA's work on UNDRIP, for example, intersects with other work that you're doing, such as Two-Spirit and LGBTQ inclusion?
Yes. This question is very exciting.
You were delighted to.
I am so excited to answer this question. Thank you so much for asking it. This has been such a great presentation, just let me say, as we're winding down. It's been so nice to communicate this project into a space with a lot of really knowledgeable people asking such like insightful, specific questions. It's really encouraging. And this question is wonderful because this is something that I have been working on and towards since I started with the CMA 5 years ago. And for any of you who worked a long time in nonprofits, you get that these things take time to see actioned because you have to work through your various hierarchical authoritative structures, you have to work through your grant applications, you have to build up to these moments. What is so wonderful about kind of hitting the next phase of the CMA's evolution and starting it with this report is that this report now gets to flow into everything else we do at the CMA, and it has to be considered as an integrated piece of how we do the rest of the work that we're going to be engaging in. And what is extremely exciting is that we have some very out-of-date ethics guidelines on our website that go back to 1999, and they are definitely in need of a refresh. And I encourage all of you to, I'll put the links in the chat. We have some sessions next week, actually, where we're asking for community feedback on the ethics guidelines because we're going to be undertaking a 3-year strategy to remake those. And so where it speaks to those intersectionalities, all of that stuff has to come through in this general discussion of ethics, all of the topics that we might engage in. And as a function of the outcomes of the Move to Action report, we have to consider that Indigenous self-determination and those perspectives within all of the considerations of the ethics, given our relationship and our responsibility to UNDRIP in that work. So it's coming and it's already starting to be included. You would have also seen potentially, we just completed our first workplace diversity survey here at the CMA, which was an intersectional approach to understanding the demographics of museum staff currently. And it's something we hope to repeat and continue to develop as a tool, as a measuring tool for the sector, so that we can actually see if we're able to build diversity within our sector. And Ninesh Kamat, who led that project, was so careful to really consider all of the avenues of intersectionality through gender identity and sexuality, through racial identity, community identity, religious, all of these things, and disability and accessibility. So that's also something that's going to feed into some of this ethics guidelines work as we continue it. So yes, very exciting a couple years coming up for us as well when it relates to this kind of stuff.
That is exciting. Stephanie, any last thoughts on that? Okay, so let's all give Stephanie and Rebecca a big emoji round of applause, because you can't turn your cameras towards your sound. And thank you for that really, really fantastic and enlightening conversation. Like I said, we want to continue this conversation at the Native American Art Studies Association conference in the fall. The link is in the chat. Please scroll up, come to the conference, submit a paper. There's actually a lot of individual calls for paper, but what we really want to talk about that day is what is coming. What's the future? Are you doing something amazing in your own institution that you think people should know about as a model for where we're going? It's not about the history. It is about how are we moving to action. Like, bring that back around. So we're really hoping you're going to join us. Please follow us on Facebook. Thinking Through the Museum on Facebook. The link is in the chat, and also subscribe to the newsletter. We're going to leave the poll. We're going to leave the Zoom open for a few minutes so everyone could please do the exit poll. And just our sincere thanks to everybody who joined again today. This has been a great conversation and the beginning of so much more work to do. So we're grateful for you all to be doing this work, for us all to be working on this together. Thanks so much. And I think that's great. We'll probably stop recording now. Awesome. Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Stephanie. That was